Hi everybody and welcome to Budo no Kuni, the land of martial arts. This video, hopefully this series of videos, is brought to you by martial arts video production company BAB Japan, its monthly magazine Hiden, and its website BudoJapan.com. Hiden specializes in what are called the koryu bugei. These are martial arts that were created before the Meiji restoration of 1868. In a sense, these are the arts where the martial arts we know today, like Kendo and Judo, come from. And BudoJapan.com is a website with selected material from Hiden magazine, translated in English, the original being in Japanese, of course, and some videos from BAB Japan's extensive library. Right below, you can find links for Hiden, for BudoJapan, and for BAB Japan. Check them out, and if you see anything you like, you can contact us, you can share anything you want. So, Budo no Kuni is of course Japan, and in this series of videos, we want to introduce you to some people, non-Japanese, who have been in Japan for many years and practiced these arts and became proficient in them. And my name is Grigoris. I've been working for Hiden for the last 6 years now as a writer and occasional photographer, and I've been also practicing these arts, one of these arts, for the last 10 years, first in Greece, where I come from, and now here in Japan. And for this first episode of Budo no Kuni, I'm happy and honored to have with me Ellis Amdur, one of the best-known koryu practitioners, teachers, and researchers in the West. His involvement in the martial arts goes back almost 50 years now, 13 of which he spent here in Japan, where he first studied aikido, and then Araki-ryu Torite Kogusoku, and Toda-ha Buko-ryu, becoming licensed in both of them. After returning to the US, he continued practicing, teaching in the US and in Europe as well. We'll talk about that. And he has written 3 books which I believe must be in every martial arts library. These are Dealing with Ho-sensei, Old School, and Hidden in Plain Sight. What I think is even more interesting is that he has found a way to use his martial arts training in his job as a psychotherapist and a specialist in the escalation of extreme states and crisis intervention. And in this field he has also written extensively. He has written, I counted 13 titles, which are mostly specific to professions that have to deal with these situations on a daily basis, like law enforcement, social workers, teachers, hospital staff and such. You can find links for all this, again, below. Make sure to check them out, and if you are interested in martial arts, which I'm assuming you are, and haven't learned a bit, read his books. Their perspective is unique. They're very different from what you expect from a martial arts book, and I think even if you're not practicing his arts, they will make you see your art in a different light. So, now for me, let's go to Ellis. Again, thank you very much for being here. And your personal history is pretty much all over the internet. You write in your books as well, but since this is the first episode of a series, could we have the Cliff Notes version? And you first started doing martial arts in?
I was 15 or 16. And I first did some backyard karate.
Okay.
A man who was a legend in his own mind. I didn't know any better. I lost a fight, and that's where I started.
Okay.
Then I trained, there was a wonderful Chinese martial artist named Alan Lee, who was the first Chinese teacher on the east coast of America who was teaching non-Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his leading students, named George H.X., started a Nation of Islam faction of his school. and I joined it because they needed a Jewish guy.
That's an interesting combination, Chinese with Nation of Islam.
Yeah, yeah. And so I did that for a while, and later walked into an aikido school. I hadn't really been so interested in Japanese martial arts, but there was something about, there's a kind of cleanness and austerity in Japanese martial arts that's really attracted to me. And started training aikido in the States, and then off to Japan I went.
You came to Japan to continue your practice in aikido, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And well, again, it's it's a big subject, and you have written about him. But you're right. Your main aikido teacher was Terry Dobson, right?
Yeah. So for those who don't know, there's a fellow named Terry Dobson, who was probably the second live-in student at the Aikikai, a non-Japanese live-in student. Foreigners have trained in Aikido longer than most people know. There were Russians training in Manchuria in the 1940s with Inoue Noriaki. There was an Italian man, I haven't been able to find any more about him, who actually trained in Tokyo about 1940. But the first really significant figure was Andre Noke, who was an official representative of French Judo Association. And I believe he lived at the Aikikai for about 2 years.
Now we are talking about the period that Ueshiba Morihei were still alive, right?
Yes, this would be in the 1950s. And Mr. Noke was a very stable, established figure, a mature man. And Terry sort of blundered into Aikido. Literally, he followed Yamada Yoshimitsu, a rather well-known instructor, was doing a demonstration. Terry blundered into this demonstration. There's a lot more to the story, but the Cliff Notes version.
Okay.
And he followed him back to the Hombu dojo from Yokohama like a stray dog and wouldn't leave. And nobody knew what to do with him. And one thing led to another. He wanted to train Aikido. He was enthralled. And eventually, it was proposed by, I believe it was Tamura Sensei, that he become an Uchideshi. Many people opposed the idea of this, not only because he was non-Japanese, but because he was a real struggling human being. But Ueshiba Morihei specifically said he wanted him, and that's how he became a student. Terry is kind of unique. Aikido is so many things to so many people. And a lot of people see it almost in salvationist terms, that training in Aikido is going to save the world, make world peace. Other people see it as a really hardcore martial art, although very few these days. Some people see it as a martial art that's kind of ritualized, attenuated. You have all these different perspectives. And Terry was right in the middle of all that, because he definitely saw Aikido as a transformational activity that could change society, but he was also concerned himself, that this art has some practical value. And I think he summed up a lot of the struggles of a non-Japanese person trying to learn an art with very traditional layers to it that he impartially understood to some degree. On another level, because he was like a bull in a china shop, he went very deeply into some things. I think one of the most important things Terry said is, one of the remarkable things about Ueshiba Morihei is he would single you out, and he would look at you and implicitly say, all these other guys, I'm just teaching them what little they can understand. I'm giving you the real thing. And he said to me, I honestly believe that that's what Ueshiba said to me. But I also know he said it to everybody else. And I'm the only one who thinks that's funny. So that was, when I met Terry, he was at a small dojo off the Bowery in New York.
He had been in Uchideshi and returned to the US, right?
Yeah, with many colorful adventures in between. So he had a small little dojo off the Bowery. I ended up living there for about 9 months, I believe it was, and then off to Japan I went.
Okay. And so you continued your practice, your Aikido practice here in Japan at the Hombu dojo, and also at another dojo, a different dojo was your main dojo, right?
Right. So I trained at Kuomori dojo. It was a young dojo cho named Kuomori Yasunori. It's in Sakura-dai. Still exists as a dojo. Yasunari was the epitome of a modern Budokan. He was a genuine man. He was kind, he was strong, he did judo, he did aikido, and he had no pretensions. And so that was my home dojo. And what he said to me is that he said, I got enough students. I don't need you as my student. I'd rather you were my friend. And so what he did is he made sure that my hakama had his dojo name on it, because that way, wherever you go, people will know you're associated with this dojo, so you're a guest. And you'll be welcomed as a guest, and nobody will be concerned that, well, is he trying to move into the school, is he going to be a member? And so for about a 2-year period, I was, aside from the Aikikai Hombu and Komai Dojo, I was going to 5 other dojos on a regular basis. In particular, the most important teacher I had was Kuruiwa Yoshio, former boxer who had a very unique style of Aikido. So that was 2 years. I was training like 5-6 hours a day, and about 4 hours on the train every day.
And at some point you came across the koryu arts, right?
Right. So I started.
How did that happen?
There's a fellow named Mike Skoss who's also very prominent. Some folks may know the name. Very prominent practitioner of a lot of koryu. And he and I were friends. Actually, he stayed in my apartment for a couple of months when he moved up to Tokyo. And he went to get a haircut. He lived in Shinjuku. I don't know why he used to go to Nakano to get a haircut. But he comes back and he says, well, there's several martial arts schools training at the Nakano Taikan. There was Toda-ha Buko-ryu, there was Yagishin-kage-ryu, and there was Araki-ryu. And so he just mentioned it, and I thought, well, I'd like to go see Araki-ryu and not do it, and then go to Kengaku at Yagishin-kage-ryu because that's so elegant, and I'd like to do that.
Of course.
So I visited the Araki-ryu school. It was kind of a comedy of errors because I didn't speak very much Japanese. The teacher was very guarded. And my first impression of it was one of the roughest physical activities I'd ever seen. But I watched the class for 3 hours. I sat in Seiza. The teacher walked up to me and said, you can start next week. And without any intention, I said, I'll be there. I didn't even know why. But when I make a promise, I keep a promise. So now I was a member of the school. The next day I went to Yagishin-kage-ryu. They invited me to join. I really wanted to. And I said, I'm sorry, I've already made another commitment. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I started training Araki-ryu. And as it turned out, it suited me a lot better. Yagishin-kage-ryu is like a diamond, and it's very polished. And I like things with rough edges. So that's why.
And gradually you stopped training Aikido and focused on Araki-ryu?
Yeah. So I was training Aikido from 1976. Trained Aikido through 1978, and I realized I just no longer leaned to that physical activity. I wanted to, my body, myself, I wanted to be doing Araki-ryu. And about in 1978, I also started doing Toda-ha Buko-ryu. I wanted to do something with my then life, and Araki wasn't suited. So we both joined the Toda-ha Buko-ryu dojo, and I am very firmly convinced doing too much is the same as doing nothing. It was quite a struggle to do 2 martial arts, and fully committed, shall I say. So I felt it was time to discontinue Aikido because it would be disrespectful to continue.
At that time, you also met another legendary figure, Donn Draeger, right?
I met Donn 1976. Yeah, when I arrived.
Yeah. And I understand that he was, because these arts were still very, very new, and the idea of going to Japan to study these arts, even though some people had already done it, it wasn't as popular or as easy as it is now, right? So I understand that most people who came from the West, especially the US, to get involved with the martial arts, generally gravitated towards Donn Draeger.
Yeah,
in a way.
It was a natural thing. One, a lot of folks came to do judo, and he was brilliant at judo, and he was a senior member of the Kodokan. But Donn was such a larger-than-life figure. You know, it's kind of a funny story, but when I was on my way to Japan, Terry Dobson said, well, get a chance to check out Donn Draeger. And all I knew about him is he'd written a few books. Right. And I looked and I curled my lip and I said, I don't really want to talk to people who just write books. I'd like to meet some practitioners. And Terry sort of laughed and said, okay. And then I met Donn. He's built like a Greek god. He'd do full splits. He could do, I believe, in his 50s, he was doing squats with over 500 pounds on his shoulders. He's just a perfect physical specimen. He was very smart. He was very studious. And he, in a sense, was the godfather of most foreigners who were training, at least in the Tokyo area. And there was something in me that really said, I don't want to be that close to that. I don't want to be a part of that. Because it was like, I've gone all the way to leave my home, and there's a package waiting for me that I can just slide into, and I can be one of Donn's boys. And that's fine. And I'm not, in no sense am I criticizing anybody else who did associate with Donn to that degree. But I just felt, why would I leave my home to be comfortable?
Right.
And so I was friendly with Donn. I learned from him whenever I talked with him, but I was not closely associated with him for that reason, so that I could make my own way.
Okay. Going back to your two arts, and again, without going into many specifics, but your arts are very different, and the people who taught you your arts were very different, starting from one was a man, the other was a woman, a young man, and a middle-aged woman, I think Mita used to say was at that time. But I understand from what you've told me and from what I've read about them was that they shared a very deep love about their arts. They were very earnest in what they did and very passionate about their arts. And could you tell us a few words about them, as many or as little as you would? Because I believe that a part of them still lives in you, right?
Yeah, I probably dream about my Aikido teacher 3-4 times a week, so I'm always doing keiko. But they're very different. Araki-ryu Torite Kogusoku. Look, there's several factions of Araki-ryu, each one's different, and one of the traditions in Araki-ryu is Ichikoku, Ichiden. Araki spread all over Japan without ever having a soke. Each shihan would move to a different area, and what was necessary in Morioka was not what was necessary in Yamagata or in Saitama or in Joshu. Each Araki-ryu, most Araki, shall I say, kept a core of what was called the Torite Kogusoku, close grappling, but then the weapons would elaborate in very different factions.
So you have big changes between different factions.
Radical. And then you might have Araki-ryu Yawara, there's Araki-ryu Jujutsu, there's several factions of Araki Shinyu, where even the core techniques would change, and yet it was still Araki. I mean, the easiest way for me to explain the essence of the art is it's sort of like a Wolverine. They fight low to the ground, you fight in close, and it's calculated aggression. It's not the disinhibited aggression of pure Jigenyu, for example. It sometimes appears like that, but if you will, there's always something held a little bit in reserve, so that you aren't 110% committed to a technique. You're 100% with 10% extra. Okay. It's somewhat different. We had a very severe practice. Bit by bit, we had very few students. In fact, I ended up in that particular line, the last student of my generation. You were literally the last man standing, right? Yeah. It was just there was a lot of pressure on a lot of levels because I had a very old school teacher who felt that you don't just come to the dojo and learn some techniques for a couple hours. If you choose to study with an individual, you have incredibly deep, now intertwined obligations and ties. And they don't stop when 5 o'clock when the practice is over. There's a kind of almost oyabun kobun kind of relationship would be one way to put it, or daimyo kerai kind of relationship. And it's a mutual obligation. One of the things I got from my teacher, I don't particularly like to teach.
Yeah, I would come to that.
Yeah. But you have an obligation to teach if somebody truly sincere comes. You can't avoid that obligation.
Because this is why you were taught, right?
Right.
Because if your teacher didn't want to teach, period, then you wouldn't have learned this as well.
Right, and somebody felt the same toward him.
Right. So it's a chain, right?
Yeah.
So you're the next link.
So in terms of combative strategy, everything appears to be in close. That grappling range is the ideal range. There's a lot more to it than that. There definitely we have weaponry for everything from nagamaki and sojutsu, kusarigama, chigiriki, which is a staff with a chain on the end of it, yofundo, which is a short chain.
With the two ways.
Two ways, yeah. A lot of stuff with dagger. So it's a very complex and extensive curriculum. Toda-ha Buko-ryu, if I liken Araki to a Wolverine, Toda-ha Buko-ryu has at its best is like a Doberman. It's very upright, very focused, very fierce, and it's always forward. You are going forward even when you're going into retreat. One of the differences is Toda-ha Buko-ryu, which has its roots in Shujyo-ryu, Toda-ryu, is there's a real emphasis on staying at blade's edge to the opponent, and they're ideally so they're never close enough to even cut you, much less grab you. So there's a real focus on my. So in that sense, it's they're very different, which leads to I think one of the most important points. In my generation, I don't teach anybody both arts. It is very difficult for anybody to truly learn one koryu. Now the one thing I start with is if somebody walks in the door and they don't have an intention to radically distort their life to learn the system in its entirety, I don't want to teach them. I'm not interested in teaching people who just find it interesting. I only want to teach people. I gave 10 years of my life, 13 years. That was the first question my Aikido teacher asked was, how long are you going to be here? I said, at least 10 years. He said, okay. If one doesn't have that commitment, and it's not just a commitment to training and practice, it's a commitment to the you, which is a living entity. Now the idea of training in Toryu is really, in a way, strange. Because now you're committed to two different, it's like being married to two people.
Yeah, like this is how you usually put it. It's like having two families, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I can say that I was Shihandai of Toda-ha Buko-ryu. I was the assistant instructor in Tokyo. And for 11 years, I never once did a Toda-ha Buko-ryu kata. It looked like it. But internally, I didn't understand Toda-ha Buko-ryu. And I can remember I was just practicing one day, and I made a cut, and all of a sudden it was like all these, just everything coalesced. And all of a sudden, this is
that was a Buko-ryu kata.
Yeah, and that's when I started really doing Toda-ha Buko-ryu. And because of that, I mean, I trained on a very, very intense level. Whenever I couldn't sleep, I'd lie in bed and I'd do kata, but if that didn't work, I would get up at midnight and I would train. The other commitment was I need to totally separate these. So when I'm doing Toda-ha Buko-ryu, I'm not thinking Araki. When I'm doing Araki, I'm not thinking Toda-ha Buko-ryu. Now, if I have a history of doing some level of tameshiai, of sparring, even today, and at this point things merge in my body. But when I have a Hokusei, Northwest, Toda-ha Buko-ryu dojo and a Hokusei Toda-ha Araki-ryu dojo, but they're two separate dojos.
Right.
They are not the same. And I've met very few people who are able to maintain that separation. Far too many people, in my view, who train more than one you, end up making a champon. Just mix things together. And I think that's a shame because some of the most intriguing and best things in koryu is its specificity. It's the details that only exist in that view. Yeah, and it's not only gokui, but it can be something as simple as how you organize your body. And that can be very different from one you to another. Yeah.
Okay. So, at some point let's say you graduated and you returned to the US and you continued your studies, or how did that go with your studies back in the US?
Well, the best thing in my life was training and my family. Two sons I was raising, and I was raising them in an ideal situation. We were on a hilltop near Onoji, outside Machida, and we had a house on top of this hill surrounded by an abandoned archery course, which was bamboo forest with trails, and you could just wander. I used to train there all the time. It was just ideal. But the main difficulty was I really did not like the life I was leading. I had enough money. I was teaching English. I was writing technical manuals on a labeling machine factory. And none of that I felt like I was contributing anything. And I inherited something from my teachers and felt it very strongly myself, that how can you train for power and not use it? I observe far too many people who talk about having an ambition to be a teacher of Budo. Now look, there's some people that they do have a calling to be a teacher, but it seems to me at its core, Budo is something you do, and then after you've done, then you start to teach. And I hadn't done anything. So I wanted to go back to the States and use power. Now, I was looking around for what I wanted to do, and I was looking at several avenues, and I discovered crisis intervention. And crisis intervention is a subset of psychology. And specifically, you intervene in situations with people who might be having a psychotic break, might be suicidal, and might, due to a mental illness, be homicidal. And just by force of will, by communication, or shall I say in Japanese, through kamai, through kiai, you get them calmer, so that they're safer and other people are safer. And that seemed like a very interesting way to spend my days. So to do that, I had to go back to school, and I went to a program in phenomenological psychology. Phenomenology is probably the closest thing in the West to, not Zen per se, but mindfulness. It's a philosophical attempt to discover mindfulness in Western context. And so I went to a graduate program in which you studied psychology by studying philosophy texts. And you end the program not armed with any technique, but armed with a way of seeing the world. So I started doing crisis intervention, and that became a much more interesting way to spend my days. And
so, in a way, you created your own job, right? I mean, you took, on one hand, you had what you had studied in college and what you studied after returning from Japan, and on the other hand, you took what you learned in your martial arts, and you created a job where your knowledge of martial arts could be applied and have some effect, right?
Yeah. So part of it was, as I described, this kind of direct intervention. I have a subspecialty of working with people who are being stalked, trying to assess the danger and figure a way away from the stalker. I work with people who are in domestic violence situations who can't either figure out if they should leave or how to leave. For many years I was working in the field of child abuse, assessing situations in that area. So, and then I started being asked to do consultation and training, and then I started working as a consultant for several hostage negotiation teams, law enforcement teams. Ended up writing, it's one book, and the second book is almost finished on how to do training for hostage negotiation, one for police and one for prison environments. So,
yeah, I was coming to your books because people involved in the martial arts know your three books. I mentioned before, Dealing with Those Sensei, Old School, and Hiden in Plain Sight. But your writing work on your professional field is much bigger, right? We discussed that over email, and now you're up to 20 books, right?
Yeah. And I expect to have, let's see, probably 2 more this year, next year.
Okay.
Almost to the end of this year. Yeah. So I've written a series of books on really there are different versions of the same book, to be honest. But I believe it's up to 11 on tactical de-escalation of aggressive individuals. Each one is profession specific, one for cops, one for prison, one for social workers, etc. I even wrote one for a verbal de-escalation for the armed citizen, for the United States Concealed Carry Association. As I say, I've written a couple hostage negotiation books. I've written an advanced book on called The Coordinator, Managing High-Risk, High-Consequence Social Interactions in an Unfamiliar Environment. And that was part of a DARPA project, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. I was a small part of that project, trying to teach warfighters and soldiers how to communicate with people who will never trust you, who will always on some level be your adversary. And that probably most explicitly has elements I've derived from Bujutsu in terms of Kiai-jutsu, Kamai, Ma'ai. For example, Ma'ai, there are 3 Ma'ai. There's the Ma'ai of space we all know about. There's the Ma'ai of timing, which some of us know about, but there's also a Ma'ai of seishin, spirit. And you can change spacing of the spirit between people by the way you modulate your facial expression, your voice, that's all Kiai, your stance. So all of those together, how do you teach young warfighters who are going to be serving overseas how to do that in a way that they affect the situation? Just to give one example, this was not something I created, it was something I heard, and it was an exemplar. There was one area in Afghanistan, Americans were in that area, and there had been many attacks on the American force there. Very hostile environment. And one unit rotated out, and a new unit was just arriving. And as they're walking down the road, a funeral procession was coming down the road. It was Pashtun people, it was southern Afghanistan. And the head of the unit ordered his soldiers, American soldiers, to move to the side of the road, to take a knee and put their helmets over their heart. And the funeral procession passed. The people in that village were not friends to the Americans, but that particular area, that particular unit was not assaulted in the next year. Because
they respected the dead and the service that was going on.
Yeah, yeah. So it's different from making friends. Tactical communication has to maintain tactical advantage, as well as being tactful, right? As well as being respectful. So I've written on that.
What's interesting is that this shows that something that you can also learn from martial arts, that there are things that can overcome cultural differences and cultural specifics, right?
Yeah. You know, I've heard far too often non-Japanese or non-Chinese, because I've heard the same thing, will complain, well, they don't really teach us.
The Japanese or the Chinese don't really teach us.
I'm sure, look, I've met people who just say, I don't want to have anything to do with that foreigner. I get that.
Yeah.
But my experience has been that the question is not somebody not wanting to teach me. The question is they look at me and say, do I want to learn? And if they've shown me something, can I manifest that I paid attention? How many times should I be shown something? Once should be enough. You know, this whole concept, this phrase, steal the technique, wazo no sumu, does not mean something nefarious. What it means is you pay such attention to your teacher that when your teacher just moves, you say, that's probably significant. Otherwise, he or she wouldn't have done it, right? And if you pay that kind of attention, you quickly begin to improve. And then the teacher says, wow, this person is worth teaching. But if you don't pay attention to those things, why would they teach you anymore? So often the complaint that knowledge is being withheld, in my experience, has been a kind of sense of entitlement where, why aren't you just giving it to me? I'm here, I paid my dues. But the dues you pay is not the money you pay to the dojo. The due you pay is how committed are you to the teacher, which is a really intense thing, because I use the phrase, you have to be infected by your teacher. And that can be a really problematic thing, because your teacher may be a wonderful martial artist and not such a wonderful human being, or a different human being than you. And yet, if you aren't willing to accept
be influenced by him,
that influence, and somehow you have to achieve a balance. It's a very risky activity if you want to learn on that level.
Because you want to lose yourself, but not really lose yourself, right?
Right.
You want to keep something of who you are, right?
Yeah, and it's tough because people can lose their way. But this has been a dilemma of every generation of every serious martial arts practitioner. This is not something that's a problem for a Westerner who's trying to learn Japan. Japanese individuals, every generation. Think of Morihei, Ueshiba Morihei and Takeda Sokai.
Right.
You know, but I can't imagine a generation that didn't occur. So that's the real issue. If you want to learn, how willing are you to learn? How willing are you to be influenced? What are you willing to lose to learn?
Right.
And the interesting thing is, you have to be willing to not get it anyway, to fully commit, and you find the teacher that just chooses not to give it to you. And that's really heartbreaking, it's disappointing. But without that level of commitment, it's a STEMI. Unless you offer STEMI, you're not going to learn. Right? Sometimes you're fortunate to have a teacher who is just naturally overflows.
Okay.
Right? But in a fundamental sense, that just feels easier. It's actually just as hard to learn from an open, quote, giving teacher, because the subtleties and the depth take just as much work.
Right.
If
This
the
doesn't
teacher
change,
explains
right?
or not. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know, with an open teacher, you'll probably first get it here, and you think you've got it, but you haven't got it here. So again, you'll need to put in the time, and you can't escape that, right?
Yeah.
And this ties nicely to my next question. It would be that, like you already said that you don't like teaching, but this is a debt that you're paying to your teachers, right? And but you have taught and you are still teaching, and I can personally testify because I didn't say that before, but one of the ways I know Ellis Amdur is because he was my first Toda-ha Buko-ryu teacher while I was in Greece. And you started teaching our Buko-ryu group in Greece, and then in Spain, and where else is it?
That's it.
That's it. But you also teach Araki-ryu in the Netherlands, right?
No, that dojo closed.
Ah, okay.
I closed it.
Okay. Anyway, but you not only you taught, but you taught and are still teaching in a different way than you were taught, right? In a seminar way, right? Twice a year, intensive weekly or 2 weekly sessions, and in a way that is, I know that it's touching on you, it's tiring for you, right? Taking a plane, you know, crossing an ocean to come to the other side of the world and do 10 days of these schools. I mean, I always, you know, wondered why you do that, and what, I mean, how difficult it was and what challenges it had teaching this way.
Well, currently I have one active Araki student in America. I have one active Toda-ha Buko-ryu student in America. They come to my house. I don't take any money for my teaching. I'm not saying, you know, if my family was starving and I couldn't get work, these are survival arts, I would, but I don't have to, and so I don't. I don't want to depend on my students for my new car, or repairs to my old car, doesn't matter. I don't want any, because as soon as you have that dependency, then you change the way you teach to please the students to keep them. And I honestly don't care if they don't show up again, right? I only want people who want to be there. Okay, so what happened was a certain somebody, Grigori translated my first book, Dueling with O-sensei, into Greek. And the publisher was hoping that if he brought me over, that it would sell a lot of books. It didn't work that way. But while I was teaching, I taught an aikido seminar, which is it's an odd thing. I mentioned I quit aikido in 1978. Aikido became an interesting lens to write about martial arts. That's how Dueling with Do-sensei came about. And people would occasionally ask me to come teach. And I don't view myself as an Aikido teacher. I view myself as somebody who trained in Aikido very assiduously. And using Aikido as a frame, I'll bring in information that I've derived from other martial arts that hopefully will enhance people's Aikido practice. At any rate, while I was there, I showed about 5 or 10 minutes of Toda-ha Buko-ryu, and I showed about 5 or 10 minutes of Araki-ryu. And I was contacted first by somebody who wanted to know if he could come to the States to train Araki-ryu. I knew he had no jobbable skills, or if that's a word. I didn't want to take care of him. And so I sort of blew it off. And then somehow you and I were discussing training in Naginata Jutsu. And I just came up with an idea, and I made a proposal. I said to Greg, I said to this other fellow, get together 6 to 8 individuals who really want to learn. And I would come, and the first time I came was for 3 weeks. And the first time I came, I taught 8 hours. I'd be 4 hours of one school, 4 hours another, different groups. So 15 days in a row, or whatever, 20 days in a row, 8 hours a day. And what I said is, I'm going to teach you with all sincerity, as much as you can possibly hold. And then I'm going to come back in 6 months. And if you aren't 2/3 as good as you'd be as if I was here every day, I'll never come back again. Now, I don't know either what 2/3 as good means. But anyway, it's basically, the model I had was this, where I see a lot of study groups fall down, where, you know, a koryu teacher will come once or twice a year to the different countries.
Yeah, now it's been done. Yeah, it's quite good.
Where I see them fall down is one person becomes the designated Shihandai, or dojo senpai. And so that individual is the go-to person to say, well, this is how the teacher taught. Whatever mistakes they make now corrupt the whole. And so what I said is, I don't care who started first. You are a collective brain.
You were very clear on that.
And everybody, each and every person can correct another person. This is what I remember Ellis teaching. And the goal would be, even when there was a disagreement, then collectively, sort of like that old story of the blind man and the elephant, can you come to a consensus of what the elephant looks like? And I didn't know if this was going to work, but it works astonishingly well. But it works astonishingly well because the people I'm teaching are really committed. I mean, I think it's fair to say the vast majority of koryu practitioners in Japan go to the dojo once a week. Right? Some more, but mostly once a week. My guys in Araki are training 4 times a week. Buko-ryu, they tend to train about 3 times a week. One of my Araki students had a baby with colic, and so the way he soothed his baby is he did suburi with the baby. He would take the baby and lo and behold, the baby calmed down. So there's an Araki phrase, make your practice a friend in the morning and a pillow at night. It's got to pervade your life. And because the best of my students in Greece and now in Spain are doing that, they're progressing, even though I'm not there supervising every day. But had I done it the usual way, with, okay, you're the dojo senpai, you become my mouthpiece, I think it would have been a disaster from a perspective of really passing on anything of value.
No, I can say that from personal experience that it worked, and especially for the first 2 or 3 years, we could practice every day because the circumstances were this, and we could really practice every day. And I remember that it was my problem when I first came to Japan, was that, like you said, in Japan, this practice is once a week, twice if you're lucky, and if your ryu has its own space. But in Buko-ryu's case, because we still use the Nakano Taikukan, it's just once a week. So if you're not practicing at home, well, you're not going to get any better. And you know, people ask me how it's practiced in Japan, and I say, well, less than it was in Greece, which is a weird thing to say, but it is anyway. There's another matter that I want to ask you about, and it's again a matter that you have written extensively about, and it's about the pair innovation and tradition, right? These arts, especially since we're talking about classic traditions, classic schools, they are, part of a big tradition going back centuries, right? And many people, especially in the West, believe that this means that they are, something like museum exhibits that you put in a glass case, and you shouldn't even touch them. And I'm thinking that even the Japanese are, in a way, to blame for that, because some of these arts have been designated as cultural treasures, local or something. But I know that, well, your idea is not exactly this, right?
No.
So I would like you to share a few thoughts about this, counterpoint between tradition and innovation, how they fit. Because again, in your case, both in terms of practice and in terms of theory, you have done a lot to innovate your schools and to innovate your thought about your schools and other schools in general, and especially your old school and hidden and plain sight. They literally break new ground in koryu research and in koryu practice as well, right? So, could you please elaborate?
Yeah. Well, koryu used to be a term of insult. In the Edo period, saying koryu da, that would mean an archaic school, probably rusticated and countrified, that only did kata in a sterile form, never tested themselves, as opposed to the more vibrant schools like, take your pick, Shinto Hatakage-ryu, that added Gekiken, right? So there is a tension. On the one hand, the arts have a legacy, or an alleged legacy, of people who actually used this on the battlefield. But that's actually been rather overblown. Because although somebody may have used a martial art in the 15th century or before, there's also a possibility that the founder of the art did not organize the art.
Right.
I'm convinced that for the most part, what happened was young men would gather around an old guy, an old warrior, and say, how did you survive? They go, wow, I did this and this and this. And somebody's like, writing it down. And the training was probably second at minimum, at best, the second or third generation people were the people who tried to organize what was shown in very informal fashion.
And you can see this happening in armies even today, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people go to veterans and say, what are you doing? At first they sound like war stories, just, things to say over a couple of beers, but there is actual combative wisdom transferred to that, right?
Sure. And in the Edo period, one thing that people don't realize is the Ryu vastly expanded their curriculum. Because just like in business, if I'd like a better salary, I go to a seminar. I get continuing education credit. I show my certificate, and they say, oh, okay, we're going to raise your salary by, $1 an hour because you got this extra training on human resources. Well, the same thing happened in Budo. And what would happen is, it was a mutual thing that many teachers of Ryu started expanding, making new kata, new elaborations of the kata, and making new menjo. And each menjo you had to pay for. It wasn't free. You paid for each one. The reverse was, the person who acquired the menjo could go to his daimyo and say, I just got a gomokoroga, and you get a couple more bushels of rice. So there was a mutual support for the elaboration and intellectualization of a lot of techniques. So there's innovation is something that's occurred throughout koryu history. And here's the other thing. Sometimes innovation would occur within a school. For example, Manewa Nenyu adopted the Yadome Jitsu, and I believe it was, I'm gonna guess at this point, I think it was the 16th generation. And it was the teacher felt, that particular Higuchi sensei felt, that his students were losing valor. They weren't being tough and courageous enough. And facing somebody who's firing an arrow at you, you know, that's going to increase your valor. So these changes occur. You know, I'm actually privy to information that certain you would rather I didn't talk about, so I won't. But I know that some sets that have been presented throughout the Showa period were created either at the beginning of the Showa period or in the Showa period or, you know, whatever, Taisho and Meiji. Not everything goes back to the founder. Okay? So that's always existed. And you know, the other thing is when somebody started innovating too much, there's always been a fail-safe. Okay, I'm no longer doing, take your pick, use my own, Araki-ryu. Now I'm doing Araki-shinyu.
Right.
Right? You make a new ryu. Or I'm doing Kasumi Shinyu, which is another offshoot. I've changed it enough, I've innovated enough, we have these offshoots.
Or make it a ha, or, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this has occurred throughout history. I do understand how fraught an idea this is. That somebody has the arrogance to say, you know, I'm going to change what has been passed down by, take your pick, seasoned warriors, by this powerful lineage. And so the idea that somebody who is not Meikyo Kaiden, who is not a legitimate Meikyo Kaiden, who's truly got the view in their bones, in their nervous system, making changes, I think that's wrong, right? But if you have somebody who has achieved that level and looks at what they do and says, you know, I don't think this is going to keep my students as safe as they could be. You know, one place I occasionally go, both to teach and learn, is the Fighter's Garage. It's a BJJ, Krav Maga, and Filipino martial arts school outside Maryland. And I'm asked to present on specifically using, I'll teach a little bit of Aikido, which is grappling with knives. And I've got people who, I mean, the guy who runs the school was two-time Pan Am BJJ heavyweight champion, black belt. And so, quite naturally, they've got to test what I'm teaching. That's the way it should be, right?
Yeah.
And there have been times I go, oh, that doesn't work.
Okay.
Somebody handed it to me, it doesn't work. So what do? Do I say, I have a cultural treasure, I've got a Chippendale chair that nobody can sit on anymore?
Right.
Or do I fix that chair? And my inclination is to fix it. Sometimes, because the ryu are so different, Araki-ryu, Ichikoku Ichiden, it's built into the ryu. Toda-ha Buko-ryu is a lot more conservative, but I look at the films we have of 2 generations back, last generation, actually now 3 generations back, there were changes that were occurring. I have waited 40 years to make one or another change, but it's just something that's not sit with me for 40 years. I say, we need to adjust this. So, there's a final question, which is, does it retain the core character of the school? Can you yourself, can your teacher say, that has Toda-ha Buko-ryu Dashita? Does that have Araki-ryu Dashita?
Oh, so, I was going to say that because you just mentioned about the Russia of the school and that Buko-ryu is more conservative than Araki-ryu, and it's interesting that it's in Buko-ryu that you have made some contribution. Well, it's not exactly innovation. It's finding things that used to be there but weren't, and bringing them back to life.
Well, I was up to Komatsuzaki Koto and Yazawa Isawa. Toda-ha Buko-ryu had a much more extensive curriculum. And somewhere between the next headmistress, Murakami Sensei, or Kobayashi Sensei, a lot of it disappeared. And so Kobayashi Sensei only presented on 36 kata. And without going into a lot of detail, there were some records remaining of some of the kata that were abandoned. Bojutsu, Sarigama Jutsu, and Nagamaki Jutsu. And Nita Sensei explicitly requested that I study these and see if I could revive them. I'm aware that some schools don't do that, but our school did. And basically, the bojutsu is a broken bladed naginata. Saigama was pretty manifest. Nagamaki, we had records. Those were once upon a time our Menkyo Kaiden kata. And we had descriptions of them. And so what I did is I did the very best I could to figure out those movements from the descriptions, and then consulted with Nita Sensei. With the bojutsu and the Nagamaki jutsu, she was very happy with them. And they were included then as part of the curriculum, as a betsuden. The first version of the Sarigama jutsu, she looked at it and all she said was, "Sore wa chotto koryu rashiku nai." That's all she said. And I felt terrible because that's all it takes. She basically said what I'd done did not do justice to our ryu. It might work, it might be good, but it was not buko-ryu because it's more than just the technique. And so I took another year and I worked on them and I reworked them. I showed her again and she said, "Torite." So those are part of a betsuden. One thing we are is very explicit. We have it in the makimo that these were revived through the efforts of senior practitioners and Nita Suzuki. It doesn't pretend that this was passed down unbroken.
So the next generation will know exactly what happened, right?
Yeah. It's now part of the transmission, and I'm responsible for ensuring that other individuals learn those properly. But I think it's important that we're honest with our history, because any lie in the history. Now, I'm not talking about a lie like the ryu was passed down from Tengu, or Kiso Yoshinaka, or Tomoe Gozen was our founder. I mean, that kind of thing in a prehistory period, people were saying, how could our ryu not be influenced by Tomoe Gozen? She was so significant, and every time I think of her, I think, that's a different kind of thing as opposed to in our generation saying, well, these particular kata were passed down unbroken. Right? It's important to say we revised these kata because who are we saying it for? We're saying it for our own members. With the exception of discourse like this, why would anybody else be concerned about what people are doing within a dojo anyway? Yeah.
One last thing I would like to ask, it's more generic, and we decided to call this series Budo no Kuni. And you've lived in Japan. At different time, you keep on visiting Japan, and you are part of, the martial arts world, martial arts scene. And so, I would like to ask you, what do you think about the future of these arts, especially in Japan, and in the way that now both the arts and Japan are becoming more, internationalized? I mean, what do you think about the future of these arts?
Gosh, it's a tough question. It's a tough question because it's a complex question. Koryu almost died in the Meiji period. And it started to die in Bakumatsu when individual daimyo began to order their own shihan of various ryu. Within 1 year, for example, you will merge all these ryu. This started before Kendo. They were saying, they were starting to see the encroachment of the West and the threat to Japan as a culture and a nation. And so there were already moves, how can we protect ourselves? And if we have 15 ryu in one, how do we train together, right? So there was already this homogenization process. And then in one sense, Japan suffered a terrible defeat, culturally speaking, with the entry of the West into Japan. It happened in such a shock. And there was really this abandonment of traditional arts. I've forgotten his first name, Erwan Beotz, who is a German, who was the physician to the imperial family. He became fascinated and joined Shinkagyu dojo briefly, and that got a lot of publicity. That a foreigner thought these archaic arts were so interesting. He tried to join Jujutsu, and he was told that, well, you have to do this sort of art from childhood. That wasn't exactly true, but everybody was afraid if we break the arm of the physician to the imperial family.
We come to
But he was instrumental in bringing Yoshinyu to Tokyo, right, where it was mostly located in Chiba, and the first matches between Yoshinyu and the Kodokan, which have been really should I say, rewritten to the Kodokan's advantage. But those first matches, Bales was a part of that, sort of getting that going. When Japan sort of hit modern times, there was a simultaneous movement to modernize martial arts, but also to use koryu to strengthen the spirit of the nation, right? And we can go into a lot of extraneous detail, good, bad, and different. So there was a kind of a revival of koryu. But I have to say, koryu was already having hard times in the 1930s. In 1936, the Kobudo Shinkokai was founded. Now consider the name, Kobudo Preservation Society. That it was necessary for different you to actually group together to survive, as opposed to
each other. Yeah.
Right. Why would we need each other? Why should Ito-ryu need Yagyu-ryu to help it survive, right? Once upon a time
they were
rivals, right? But it was already that attenuated, right? Now, World War II happens, and this sounds very trivial, and koryu. But after World War II, many teachers died during the war. Right. There was the ban on martial arts practice. People had to do it in secret.
And during the restoration, practicing Budo was not the first priority for many people, right?
To survive, right? But there was a generation, I arrived at the tail end of most of that generation, where many of the teachers had experienced war. Nita Sensei walked out of Toda-ha Buko-ryu, walked out of the Tokyo firebombing, to survive. She walked all the way to Mitaka. Other teachers I've met fought in war, right? So their koryu practice had a particular virility, a particular ferocity, and a particular seriousness. This is not just a hobby they were doing.
You can even steal that in some of the videos of the early demonstrations back in the 70s and 60s. You can see a very different spirit in those groups, even when they were old.
Yeah, yeah. Now another generation's come, and this tension between, well, nobody's going to fight with a spear, nobody's going to fight with a sword, so are we just doing a hobby? How do you train as if you're going to fight with a spear, even though you know you never are? How do you train with that seriousness? And a lot of people don't know why they would, right? So there's a real danger that for most people in Japan as well as the West, this becomes a kind of exciting hobby. There's a lack of seriousness about it. Also, I'm the beneficiary, certainly, of being allowed to train in these archaic arts, and certainly in terms of writing and things I've done, I'm a small part of the way these arts are spread. But when I hear that one or another koryu has study groups in, say, 17 countries and 3,000 members, that's not koryu anymore. Because koryu has to be taught face-to-face. It has to be taught with a master instructor. And by master instructor, I mean someone who has mastered the school, not somebody of a rank. But they truly have mastered the school, passing on an essence to somebody else. And there's a real danger when you start having a group that is supervised by somebody who trains with somebody else, who goes to Japan once a year. You no longer have koryu. And I do worry for the future of that. I don't have an answer for it either. The only answer I have is to try to ensure that the people that I work with at least maintain as much of that seriousness and ferocity as possible. And yet, here's the interesting thing. The best koryu schools I've ever been to always have laughter as a part of it. The same way the most relaxed military people I've always met are the most highly trained. Right? They don't need to be stiff. They don't need to have shouted orders because they know what they need to do. I call it wolf pack etiquette. In wolf pack etiquette, the wolves are all attuned to the alpha wolf. And when the alpha wolf's relaxed, everybody relaxes. But at the fraction of a second that the alpha wolf is focused, all the other wolves are focused. And to me, that's the way the koryu should run. And that only occurs when there's an intimacy. So I am worried about, on one level it sounds elitist to say, I'm worried about all this koryu spreading, but I'm also worried about the essence, the specialness of it just dying. And that would be a tragedy, because there's things that are so unique that only occur in a small, intimate group.
Anyway, like you said, I mean, you do your best to preserve that in your schools, and you know, this is the spirit that these things are done. These are families, right? So you protect your own family, you try to keep it alive, to keep it going, and then, you know, someone else will protect their own family, and hopefully, you know, they will continue surviving. And I mean, there are at least 200 of them still surviving, so we have a good, well, a good sample of what it might have been sometime in the past, right? So, anyway, it seems we're running out of time, and Ellis, I would like to thank you again for being with us in this first episode of Budo no Kuni. It's been a pleasure again. It's always a pleasure hearing you talk about this time when your passion is contagious. And of course, we would like to thank all of you for watching this first episode. Don't forget to check the links below about Ellis Amdur's work, his books, and what we do in BAB Japan, BudoJapan.com, and Hiden magazine. And if you like what you saw, you know, spread the word, tell your friends, right? Share on social networks. If you didn't, tell us. Again, you'll find contact information here, and we'll try to do better next time. Thanks very much.